Welcome to episode 307 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak encouragement into the hearts of educators and get you informed and energized for the week ahead. Today, you'll hear my conversation with Elena Aguilar, author of the new book, Arise, The Art of Transformational Coaching, as we talk about how transformation results from addressing beliefs, ways of being, and behavior. Visit truthforteachers.com for an easy-to-read, easy-to-share version of this podcast episode. Have you heard about my new curriculum line? It's called Finding Flow Solutions, and it's designed to help students manage their time, energy, and focused attention. I was inspired to take on this project because so many teachers tell me their students don't put forth the necessary effort and give up the moment that things seem hard. And together, we found that no matter how many times you say to young people, you can do this, you just have to try, it doesn't change the pattern of behavior. And that's because kids need strategies for pushing themselves through difficult tasks instead of relying on adults to do that for them. Finding Flow Solutions includes a student journal and a slideshow that are no prep for the teacher and challenging for kids, helping them learn to take initiative, focus on assignments, develop healthy cell phone habits, and self-regulate. There are 6 complete units for high school and 6 units for middle school, with the first of our elementary resources coming later in August. Go to findingflowsolutions.com to learn more. If you're a longtime listener and supporter of my work and you've never left a rating or review for Truth for Teachers on iTunes, would you take a few seconds and do that? You can click through right from your podcast player app. Every review helps boost visibility for Truth for Teachers, no matter what platform it's on. And these reviews help more educators discover the podcast. Leaving a review or even just clicking the star rating is one of the fastest, easiest ways to support the show. And your reviews mean so much to me. A huge thanks to everyone who has done this. I really appreciate you making the podcast more visible by rating and reviewing. Transformative change means feeling different, having different experiences every day, not just little changes that feel like a Band-Aid. These are the words of today's guest, Elena Aguilar, who is an instructional coach and author of multiple books, including Arise, The Art of Transformational Coaching. Through this book and through our conversation today, you are invited to teach in what Elena calls a human-centered, compassionate, wildly optimistic way. As we look toward the start of a new school year, I hope that Elena's thoughts will help you reimagine what's possible in your classroom and create conditions for both student transformations and your own. So, Elena, your work and your book Arise are all about creating transformative change. What do you mean when you talk about transformation, and how does that apply to classroom teachers?
It means feeling different, having different experiences every day, not just little changes that end up feeling like a Band-Aid, but truly feeling different, having different thoughts, seeing different things happening, having more meaningful, connected relationships with students' caregivers, with colleagues, with everyone. It's a really, perhaps even sometimes hard to imagine and different kind of experience than what we have now. I think a lot of the change that I have seen in schools, this is my 30th year working in education, a lot of the change I've seen feels like it's superficial. I've seen so many different curricular approaches, and now we're going to try this, now we're going to try that, now we're going to do this. And sometimes I can see a lot of meaningful change that has happened in these 30 years. And sometimes I think, in so many ways, not that much has changed. We went from using this kind of approach to literacy to this one, back to that one, back to this one, back to that one. And so when I think about transformative change, it's something really different. Sometimes it's hard to even imagine, but that is what gives us a clue that we're talking about transformation and not just reform or tweaking this or that part of the system.
Right. We're sort of breaking free from that pendulum swing, going back and forth and creating something brand new.
Mm-hmm.
In your book, you state that transformation results from addressing the 3 B's: beliefs, ways of being, and behavior. Can you give us an overview of each one of those before we go deeper and share why your book addresses them in that order?
Sure. So I will describe these from the experience of a classroom teacher, and I'll actually just share my own experiences. As I said, I started teaching in 1994, and that was in a rural part of California. And then I moved to Oakland, California in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I taught elementary school for about 5 years. And then I moved into middle school. And I was fortunate in my year 5, 6, and 7 of teaching to have a coach who I would say was a transformational coach. So previous to that, I'd had an occasional mentor, someone drop in and give me advice and tips. They gave me suggestions about my behavior. So that's about the instructional practices that I was engaging in, the kinds of formative assessments, how I was organizing my classroom, what was on the bulletin board, how I responded to off-task behavior, how I engaged parents. That's important. It is one of the 3 B's. That is ultimately that's what matters for kids, is our behavior. However, every single thing that we do emerges from a belief, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so, for example, I eat a lot of kale, even though I don't really like the taste of kale, and it takes a long time to chew and all of that. But one of the primary reasons that I eat a lot of kale is because I believe that it's helpful for me, that it's good for me, that it helps me have energy, and so on. And so a transformational coach addresses the beliefs. And so when I had a coach who I would describe as a transformational coach in that year 5, 6, and 7, those were actually years, they were some of the hardest years of my teaching career. And it was actually in year 5 that I really started contemplating quitting teaching. And part of it was I felt like there are certain things that no matter what I seem to try, I'm not getting better at. I'm not figuring out how to keep my classroom from being such a disorganized mess. Or I still can't figure out how to help a student who acts in this way to shift their behaviors. So what that coach did was, one of the things that she did was she helped me identify the beliefs that I held about student behavior or classroom organization. She helped me surface those. And as I surfaced those, I was able to make different choices that were different behaviors, different actions. She also helped me surface my ways of being. Ways of being has a lot to do with our emotions, but it also has to do with our values. It has to do with how we're showing up. And so I would be complaining about a student behavior, and she would ask me a question like, well, why do you think she acted that way? And I would say, well, I mean, I think, and those are my beliefs. And she said, and my coach, Liz, I should have named her earlier, Liz would say, oh, that's really interesting. Well, what do you believe is the meaning when a student does this or that? Or what do you believe about what she's able to do or what's possible? Or what do you believe about your own capacity or skill about something? And then she would also say things like, I'm hearing a lot of impatience. Liz was very direct. She would say like, you're really impatient. You got to deal with your impatience. And I was like, what do you mean? What are you talking about my impatience? She was like, well, if you weren't so impatient, you'd probably do this or that differently. And I realized, oh, she's right. My impatience was my way of being. And that was impatience. I just want to name because I find a lot of folks are impatient. Impatience actually has elements of fear in it and anger and sadness. And so when I coach people now and they say they're really impatient, I get kind of excited. I'm like, ooh, do you want to unpack that? Do you want to explore what that impatience is about? Because it's going to help you ultimately to have different beliefs and do different things. And so my model of coaching, transformational coaching, is holistic. it addresses these different domains of what it means to be a human. We have emotions, we have beliefs, and we do things. And so those are the 3 Bs. And in the book, I go in the order of beliefs, ways of being, and behavior to show how those beliefs and ways of being create the behaviors that we act. 'Cause I think a lot of times we do things thinking, well, this is just how I am. This is just what I know how to do. And it's not. It's those are things that we've learned, and they are actions that come from beliefs and that often have their roots in emotions that maybe we're intentionally working with and tapping into, or we could explore more deeply and sort of get more out of.
Yeah, I can relate to all of that because I saw myself as an impatient person. That's just how I am. Just naturally, I'm an impatient person. And when I started to really unpack that and look at the beliefs behind that, was very much fear-based. Like, if this doesn't happen now, then all of these bad things are going to happen, and it's going to throw off all of my other plans. And it was really rooted in fear and a need to control environment, circumstances, the people around me in order to feel safe. And once I started realizing that and letting those things go, I realized I'm actually not an impatient person. That was sort of my coping strategy, maybe. I don't know if that's a term that you would use, but that's the way I thought about it. Like, that's how I was trying to get through this experience. But at my heart, I can be very present and very in the moment and roll with things. And if things don't go according to plan, I can handle it. And I had to learn to build that trust in myself and to figure out what were the things that were keeping me from showing up in that way and letting them go so that I could be my true authentic self, my best self, my essential self, which is actually a person who enjoys being really present with whatever's happening and not trying to force things.
I heard you say a couple things I think are really helpful to elevate. One is that I heard perhaps the awareness that your response that you characterize as impatience was a mechanism perhaps for how you responded to situations that were in the past. And so I'm perhaps inferring something there, but this is often what happens is our current actions are reflective of how we were conditioned, how we were socialized, or how we survived, how we got through perhaps our childhoods. And the other important thing I heard you say is that when you were able to make that distinction, you were able to be present with what is. And that's what happens when we have the awareness of, okay, in previous instances, or I'm a big believer in therapy and understanding our emotional and psychological responses and how those are rooted in our childhoods. But so once you understand, like, this is not from the now, this is a reverberation, it's an echo, it's a response to something that once was, but is not now, then you're able to just respond to what is now. And that's, that mix of the fear, all those anxieties and what it means and the stories that are tangled up in there about if this or that doesn't happen. But as you said, the control, the desire for security, for safety, all of that is something that all of us contend with because it's part of being human.
So let's get into each of these 3 Bs, the beliefs, the ways of being, and the behavior. And we'll start with talking about changing those beliefs, both within the context of examining our own beliefs and in helping students shift their thinking. So in Arise, you discuss various conditions which allow beliefs to change. And you say that sometimes all of these conditions need to be in place in order for a belief to change. And at other times, a belief can change if just a few conditions are in place. So what have you learned about the conditions that are necessary for beliefs to change?
The primary condition necessary for beliefs to change is that we feel some level of safety, psychological safety, and sometimes physical safety. But we'll just talk about the psychological safety. In order to share our beliefs, in order to really shift our beliefs, we need to be able to share them. We need to talk about them. And in order to do that, we have to trust the other person. We have to trust that they won't judge us, that they see our potential. So this is all part of what it takes to create psychological safety. And so this is relevant for a teacher creating psychological safety for students to be able to share their thoughts, their ideas, their beliefs, and not worry about being silenced, judged, and so on. Now, of course, there's parameters that we have to set up in any relationship, in any classroom. There's cultivating awareness of, okay, if you choose to use these words, this is the impact it's going to have on others. And as a teacher, it's my responsibility to ensure psychological safety for everyone in the room. So you can't use those words. And so I'm trying to give a sort of a specific pointer there to it. It doesn't mean that you can say everything, but going back to, I would say, the context of a teacher with a coach. So I had a group of students who, in those years, 5, 6, and 7 years of teaching, who really were challenging for me. And they all belonged to one demographic group. And I won't name the group because this is common for many of us, that there's like, you know, it's the boys or it's the girls or it's the kids from this. And I was able to talk about that with my coach because I trusted her so much. And I was able to, in some ways, what I felt like was like confess that I hate that I have this reaction to these students. I'm so embarrassed. I'm ashamed. I feel like I'm a bad person. And I don't know what this means. And this was a context in which then she was able to help me explore those beliefs and my reactions because I felt so safe with her, because I trusted her, because I felt like she saw the best in me. She saw that I could change. She knew that there were good parts of me. She helped me recognize my own strengths. And so in order for beliefs to change, we need to feel like we can be vulnerable, we can make mistakes, we can take risks, we can share our thoughts, and we won't be humiliated. And actually, we will perhaps be guided into some self-compassion so that we can then say, okay, so this is, you know, this is what you're doing. These are some of the underlying beliefs. How do you want to change?
So safety, it sounds like, is the number one condition that absolutely has to be there. Is there anything else that's absolutely necessary in order for beliefs to change?
I think perhaps just naming that it was implicitly said in what I shared, but relationship, because we're, as human beings, we are always in relationship to others. We need others to survive. And so there needs to be relationship, and there needs to be, you know, we can talk about what characterizes a relationship in which someone can share their beliefs. And I would say there's compassion, there's curiosity, there's humility, there's courage as well, because sometimes the other person, the coach, or needs to also say, hey, you told me that you don't want to take that behavior, and yet I saw you do that 5 times this week. You know, sometimes people need to kind of bring your awareness to repeated behaviors or actions that you're taking, and that requires courage on their part.
Right.
It requires courage on the part of the teacher to say, I'm so embarrassed that I keep doing this. And so it's a relationship, psychological safety, trust.
So transformation results from addressing beliefs, as we discussed, as well as ways of being and behavior. So let's get into the ways of being, because this is my favorite overlap between your work and my work. And I think it's something that isn't addressed in a lot of professional development because it can seem like a sort of woo-woo or nebulous concept. But you have articulated what is meant by ways of being really clearly in ways that is easy to understand and really easy to, well, not easy to address, but it's clear what needs to be done and how that ties to transformation is made really clear through your work. So can you talk more about ways of being and what that looks like and how those are transformed?
Sure. So ways of being primarily is about our emotions and how we respond to our emotions, how we express our emotions. There's also elements of ways of being that relate to our values and how we act on our values. And there are aspects of ways of being that can be connected to our sense of identity and who we are in the world. So sometimes I'll build out on that one a little bit. Sometimes I hear a teacher saying something like, I can't believe I screamed at them again. I'm killing myself. I feel so much shame. And that's not who I am. It's not who I am. So what I hear when people say that, which is relatively common, that phrase, is, they're having an identity crisis. It's the crisis of a way of being. I am showing up in a way that is not who I want to be or who I think I am. And so intertwined in that, perhaps you heard it, was the experience of emotions. And so when we coach around ways of being, when we explore ways of being, we could start at the identity level or values or emotions, but often I start at the entry point of emotions to explore what someone understands about their emotions, how they respond to them, how they work with them, engage with them, feel about them. Now, sometimes people say, okay, so what's the difference between this and therapy? Or a coach will say, I'm not a therapist. How do I do this? I said that's a really important question to ask, and it's important to understand. So in the context of what a coach does, a coach might acknowledge emotions by saying something like, I'm hearing that was a really hard afternoon, and I can hear the shame that you're experiencing. Or I'm hearing there's a lot of fear here right now. A coach doesn't probe into someone's psyche or their childhood, or we don't dig, but we acknowledge emotions, and we might say, like, when were you aware that you were getting really frustrated with students? So if we're trying to backtrack from I screamed at students, when were you aware? How did you notice? Like, was it that your face got hot, or your thinking got muddled, or you noticed your heart was racing? Because what we can do then is start helping someone build some what is typically called emotional regulation skills. I like to think about, like, how can we have different relationships with our emotions as opposed to regulate or control them.
I like that.
But that's a little bit of a semantic, but it also reflects a belief that our emotions, anger is a really great emotion. It's super powerful. It has a lot of wisdom in it. We don't want to get rid of anger. We don't want to get rid of fear. We want to learn from them, and we want to express those emotions in ways that don't harm ourselves or others. But the emotion itself it's just information for us. I think emotions are our friends. And so how do we relate to them and still put some boundaries around how they behave? So there's a little bit about what is meant by way of being and how we can work with it. And perhaps there's cues in there, clues about how then that leads to transformation. It's when we address our emotional experiences, we shift our whole experience of life. When we find ways to act in alignment with our values, we're going to have a whole different experience of our emotions and our lives. We're going to feel more energized, more aligned. We're going to fulfill our need for purpose and meaning. We're going to experience self-actualization, all of those. And so that's where we dig into that deep level and experience of what it means to be human, to then draw the connections to our beliefs and our behaviors.
Can I ask why you think this is something that is not typically included in professional development? Why, when we think about instructional coaching, it tends to be focused so much more on the actual instruction rather than on the ways of being and the beliefs? Mm-hmm.
Our schools, our institutions, and our practices are reflective of dominant culture. And dominant culture doesn't value emotions. It values actions and what you do. And I'm going kind of big picture here first, but this is saying the beliefs that are dominant in our world influence what happens in schools and what happens in PD and what happens. So I'm trying to make that connection between the way that we are unconscious of the fact that in general emotions are considered to be not necessary, unhelpful, a waste of time. They make you weak. There's a whole sort of gendered element to who gets to experience and express emotions. And schools are traditionally institutions set up to maintain the status quo, to sort people. And this is historical knowledge. This is when schools were established and what their purpose was. And so instructional coaching, I often think about how much instructional coaching is like, it makes me think of Paulo Freire's analogy of the banking concept of education, where students are just receptacles to pour information into. And I think traditional instructional coaching is the same way. It's like the perception that coaches are these experts that come into teachers and pour information into them, and that's the role of a coach. That is the enactment of dominant culture, which says that people with more authority have more knowledge, and then they come in, tell you what to do, focus on the external, the behaviors, rather than actually having let's sit down and tell me how you're feeling and what's coming up for you. And that sounds really hard. And what are your thoughts about how to deal with that situation? And it's a whole different model of relating. That's why I say, like, this is transformational. This is counter dominant culture. This is an invitation to a whole different way of being. That what I've learned, because I started doing this kind of coaching 20 years ago, and then it's been about 12 or 13 years since I've started teaching this model. And what I find is that what I share with people resonates so deeply. They know this. They know it in their bodies. They've experienced it. They know it in their hearts. They know this is what they want. And so it's actually not that hard to begin doing it. It's a remembering, and it's rehumanizing. And what they really need from me is permission and perhaps a little bit of skill and strategy. But they're like, wait a minute. You can do this. You know how to do this. You know how to slow down in a conversation and pause and really listen. And that is possible. And just try it and see how it actually influences the behaviors and what you do. Because that's the other thing. There's this sort of mindset about like, well, coaches have to work in this way and they have to focus on this and that, and they have to just the actions or the instruction. And there's a belief that that's the only way to X, Y, and Z. And X, Y, and Z includes different or better outcomes and experiences for students. And that's important. But I say, try this. Just give it a little try. See what happens. Because actually, the mental model that you're holding is really limited. And there's other ways that we can get to those same outcomes, and perhaps faster, and perhaps with more joy, and perhaps we can retain teachers if we actually talk to them in a way that sees their full humanity, and so on.
So we've looked at changing beliefs. We've looked at changing ways of being. The final of the 3 Bs that can lead to transformation is that behavior piece, the external piece. So talk to us about the conditions that lead to transformation with behavior.
Sustainable long-term shifts in behaviors come from shifts in beliefs and ways of being. And so it's the same set of conditions. We can expand that. There's so much of my work is informed by research, and that's research in neuroscience and psychology and sociology and anthropology and in adult learning. And so we can look at adult learning principles and adult learning theory and consider those conditions that have been identified that need to be in place, which include things like adults need choice. They need to be able to make choices about what they learn, when they learn, what the goals are, and so on. And we know that for children as well. So when we talk about conditions for learning, and that's what we're talking about, making change in those 3 Bs, there's so much of what works for kids works for adults too. And sometimes we need to make some shifts or modifications. And of course, adults don't want to be talked to in the way that sometimes we talk to kids. But there's so much that is parallel, and that's actually a lost opportunity or a missed opportunity in so many professional development settings where, for what I see, for example, is people who were really strong teachers who are now in a position of facilitating PD, and they forget that they knew how to help kids learn, and they're not using those same strategies with adults. And yes, sometimes there's more to be learned because adults are different than children. but things like making it meaningful and relevant and giving them opportunities to share what they know and remembering that they too need choice, and all of those practices that we know work optimally for kids also often work for adults.
I want to close out the show with takeaway truth. What's something that you wish every teacher understood about how they can create conditions for transformational change?
I wish every teacher understood that they can create conditions for transformational change today. And that starts with understanding what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and making little shifts that, although this concept of transformational change might sound really big, it is evident in a conversation in the way that we listen to someone else. When someone else is speaking, are we actually taking in their words, their story, their experience, or are we thinking about what we're going to say next? Or are we spacing out? Or are we disagreeing with them and feeling judgment and having thoughts about how we, don't want to talk? So that these skills are ones that we can practice and use in every interaction we have with another person. Again, when we're listening, when we ask a question in response, when we connect with someone in the hallway before school starts, there are opportunities in every single one of those moments to experience something different than what we do now. Perhaps one of the first steps we can take is just slowing down a little bit, taking a deep breath before we respond. So I think I wish everyone understand that there are many, many little things that we can do every day in every moment that help us create a different reality. Because all we have really is this very moment right now. And so even for listeners, just taking a deep breath right now might create a different experience of this moment. Or if listeners are doing something else at the same time, so many of us multitask, just stopping for a moment and really just 15 seconds and doing one thing and taking a breath and just noticing how different the experience of the moment becomes. And transformation is the experience and the result of 1,000, 10,000 tiny little different things.